Prowler, Part 7. I was awakened by James this morning, informing me that he disposed of Liza's body near the Thames. How perfect, I thought. Quite the suitable resting place, as to now she'll be with all the other miscreants and riff-raff. Rest in peace, you filthy animal. I wiped the slumber from my eyes as James sat the tray down with my morning paper and cup of coffee. I flattened the paper to get a proper look at the headline, and once again I was pleased to see my handiwork festooned over the front page. Prowler does the unthinkable, kills shop owner at charity benefit. Damn right I did, I fiendishly thought. But alas, that's what I do. I do the unthinkable. I am without reason. I am without mercy. Now let's see what else the illuminating columnist Parker Johns has to say in detail of my latest escapade of death, shall we? I am very sad to report, ladies and gentlemen, the murder of an upstanding gentleman and one of the West End's finest proprietors, Mr. Gerald Hughes, of Mr. Hughes' pastry shop, was sadly found in the back of his shop, decapitated, I horrifically must report, and on the walls written in his own blood, said no one escapes the Prowler. Such savagery on such a kind soul like Mr. Hughes is unthinkable, yet here we are, another unthinkable death in a long line perpetrated by the Prowler. There were no eyewitness reports as for Mr. Hughes' closed-up shop alone. Scotland Yard believes, though, whoever is the Prowler attended the event at the shop and waited for the opportune time to strike. It could have been anyone, however. Reports are that the shop was filled with countless numbers of people all day for the event, and reportedly made quite a nice sum of money for the grieving family of Constable Wilkins. There was also rumored that a very prominent member of society stopped to pay his respects, a man of nobility, if you will, and it is believed that he made a sizable donation, but that isn't known for certain. The lead inspector of the Prowler Slains, Mr. Clive Richards, informs me he is going to begin a painstaking process of trying to track down and interview as many people who attended the event as possible. Godspeed, sir. We all are hoping you discover pertinent information that will finally bring the Prowler to justice. Until tomorrow, dear readers, stay safe. Ah, I would love to have the chance to meet this Inspector Richards in person, to match wits, if you will. I'm sure someone he comes across in his interviews will mention that I attended the affair. The only question is, will he have the testicular fortitude to question someone of my noble standing? The policeman's ball that my family is throwing in a few short days might give me the best opportune moment to finally meet this Inspector Clive Richards. I wouldn't be shocked if he were to interview me. That would be the forum he chose to do it in. I proceeded to get out of bed and prepare myself for the day's events. I got dressed and went downstairs for a proper breakfast. The household was abuzz with preparations for the upcoming policeman's ball. As I moved about the manor, I heard some idle chit-chat coming from my father and the head butler of the house, Mr. Lyles, as they were discussing the whereabouts of the young maid Liza. I overheard my father asking Mr. Lyles if anyone had seen young Liza, and I had to stop and chuckle at that point, but only in my head, only to myself. I must put on a believable act after all. If someone is to ask me of her whereabouts, I will know nothing of it. What you say, Liza is missing? Oh, my word! Whatever could have happened to her? I sat and enjoyed my breakfast, daydreaming of some of my past slayings, anxious to get back out on the cobblestone streets of the West End. salivating at the thought of my blade ripping into the flesh of my next victim. Now I must admit, these were not proper mealtime thoughts from such an upstanding gentleman as myself, but I could give two shits. There's nothing wrong with enjoying one's hobby. I believe everyone should have one, and I want back out there. I need to be out there. I finished breakfast, leaving before I got stuck into another boring doldrums of a conversation with my father, clamoring about God knows what, and hurried back upstairs into my chambers. Once inside, I picked up my bag and emptied its contents onto my writing desk. My surgical blade, my hatchet, and my revolver were strewn about the table, glistening as a ray of sunshine that peeked through my window hit them. They were a beacon calling to me, like a lighthouse's light calling a ship in from the fog. My tools are important, and they must be taken care of. I polished them and made sure they were in fine working order, and finished preparing for tonight. As the sun set, I grabbed my bag, put on my cloak and top hat, and made my way to the carriage. I informed James to take me to Denmark Street for tonight. I will paint its streets red with the blood of whoever crosses my path. As I stepped out of the carriage, I was greeted with the thickest fog I had ever seen. As I made my way down the street, I noticed there wasn't a soul to be seen, and the only ones out were the constables, which seemed to be more than usual. There was nothing I could do. I stood there in front of Mr. Yu's boarded-up pastry shop, filling with rage. No one out to kill, and seemingly every constable on the force walking the streets. I made this goddamn journey for nothing. I stormed back to the carriage, trying to keep my cool. I shouted at James to prepare to leave. He looked at me with a confused look on his face, shocked at how quick I was. I informed him not to say one word to me, or tonight he might be my victim. Thankfully, for his sake, he stayed quiet, and I was able to compose myself. Sadly, my macabre delights have continued to be put on hold these past few nights. The fog has continued to keep the people off the streets, and the police presence has been increased. But I have no worries, for I will soon be back out on those cobblestone streets in no time. I awoken this morning to the finishing touches of the policeman's ball for tonight. It's been over a fortnight since my journey has taken place, and I'm anxious for it to commence once again. 4 nights has been too long. Fog or no fog, I'm going out tonight. Or maybe I'll find someone at the ball to dispose of. Maybe even my date. I'll cross that bridge when it's time. But someone is most definitely feeling my blade tonight. As a matter of fact, I'll be keeping my surgical knife sheathed underneath my vest on the side. Then, if the moment strikes me, I'll be able to just carve someone up on the spot. I must clean up and make final preparations for the ball. Lady Brandy Lee Smith will arrive at the manor sharply at 7 o'clock, and I must look my best. The hour was approaching. I finished getting dressed in my party best attire. The tuxedo black, the cufflinks gold, the hair tightly slicked back, the mustache and goatee waxed accordingly. I was looking as a proper gentleman should look. I then took my surgical knife and slid it in its sheath, strapped to my vest, and then slipped on my tuxedo jacket. Now I was ready for the ball. I left my chambers at 10 minutes till 7 and patiently waited for Lady Smith at the front door. I saw her carriage approach, and as I took a quick glance at my pocket watch, the hands met at 7, right on time. Very impressive indeed. I stood there not fully expecting what to emerge from the carriage, loathing my familial duties at that very moment. The carriage door opened. I held my breath tightly, but to my pleasant surprise, out stepped an angel, the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. She truly had to have been one of the most beautiful women in all the realm. Then I quickly thought there wasn't a chance in hell that I was going to make her my next victim tonight. She was just too beautiful. No, there will be no harm done to Miss Smith. None at all. No, I must do all I can to get to know this tasty morsel a little better. I greeted her warmly with a respectful bow and asked for her arm. She smiled warmly and slightly nodded her head yes. I took her arm and proceeded to escort her into the party. We were announced as the Earl-in-Waiting, Lord Burlington, and Lady Smith. We then acknowledged the room and proceeded to move about the ball. We hobnobbed with some of the more important guests in the room, including my father, for a few short, excruciating minutes of a conversation where the man just blabbered on about our two families getting together, finally, and that we were the perfect match. We politely placated his musings and excused ourselves and went to find a quiet table in the corner to have a conversation. We found the perfect spot away from the crowd and began to find out about one another. The hours seemed to fly by as we were enthralled in our conversation. The more and more we found out about each other, it seemed to be that we were lovers in past lives. It was quite uncanny. It seemed we knew things about each other before even speaking them. The familiarity and closeness that we felt seemed like we had been together for lifetimes. It was quite strange. This entire time I've been with Lady Smith, I haven't even thought about murder. My mind has completely wandered from my macabre activities and has slowly been fixated on this beautiful woman. It was only broken by a conversation I heard from the left of me when someone loudly greeted the young inspector, Mr. Clive Richards. I sat there for a moment trying to listen, trying to hear the man who's in charge of the investigation trying to stop me. Sounds like. He and whoever greeted him began talking about the Prowler and the current status of the investigation. The inspector politely declined informing the guest that he could not divulge the current status of the investigation, for it was still ongoing. As it looked like the inspector was about to excuse himself from the conversation, I politely excused myself from the table with Lady Smith, promising to return shortly, then jumped up and greeted the inspector before he could get away. There I stood, face to face with the man Scotland Yard picked to investigate me and my devilish crimes. I introduced myself in what I believed to be a warm manner, shaking his hand and welcoming him to my family's party. He shook my hand and was very appreciative of me and my family's hospitality. We then stood there and had a conversation for a few minutes, getting to know one another. I tried to see what made the man tick. What were his interests? What kind of man he was? Generalities of his job, and so forth. Maybe even trying to probe around the Prowler investigation, but nothing direct, for I knew he would not divulge any clues. There was one thing he said that set my blood a-boil about the Prowler investigation, talking to me like I was a concerned citizen, and that's when he assured me I had nothing to fear, for he would catch this Prowler in no time, that the Prowler didn't have the skills to escape him and Scotland Yard for much longer. I tried to contain myself as he uttered the last word in that ridiculous sentence of agonizing bullshit. I felt the rage moving through my body. If he only knew that I was thinking of pulling my blade from my sheath and slicing it across his throat, as he talked to me like some concerned upper-class barrel-chested woman who gave two shites if he caught the Prowler or not. Now I was focused on what preoccupied my mind earlier in the day, and that was blood, and whose I was going to be spilling tonight. As my mind and attention began to wander of murder and savage delights, the young inspector was called from our conversation by my father and brother. We said our goodbyes, and I sat back down at the table with Lady Smith. I sincerely apologized for stepping away, and inside tried to compose myself and get my mind off murderous pursuits. Lady Smith graciously forgave me, and we continued with our conversation. As the musical entertainment began to play the midnight waltz, a very eerie and haunting piece of music, I asked Lady Smith if I may have this dance. She nodded her head in agreement and gave me her hand. We danced and continued to have the most excellent of times. We conversed and laughed the night away. I had never known anyone to make me feel the way that Lady Smith was making me feel. I wasn't thinking of death or murder, or filled with an uncontrollable rage. I was just thinking of her beauty that stood before me, and the love I was already starting to feel for her. As the ball began to wind down, I asked if we could see each other again. She said yes, of course, and we set a date in 2 days' time for a lovely quiet dinner for two. I then kissed her hand and wished her good night. I stood at the bottom of the steps in front of the manor and watched as her carriage drove off in the distance. I stood filled with a beautiful feeling I had never felt before, and already was anxious and eager to see her again. The other party guests began to pile out of the door and into their carriages. One by one they went, until there was no one left, or so I thought. As I turned to head back into the manor, I saw the young inspector, Mr. Richards, begin to stumble out of the front door. He was alone, and the bastard was quite drunk. There was no carriage waiting for him. I then noticed James in the corner of my eye, in the carriage house tending to his duties. I quickly came up with a most devilish plan. I shouted over to James to prepare the carriage, and I turned to the inspector and told him I would be honored to drive him home. What a perfect opportunity this is, I thought. I have the head inspector of the Prowler case about to be in my carriage of death alone. It's just simply perfect. James quickly pulled the carriage to the front of the manor, where we were waiting. We then piled in and drove off into the dark. The inspector was quite appreciative of my kindness and willingness to drive him home in his inebriative state. I said to think nothing of it. The pleasure definitely was all mine. We continued with some mindless chit-chat, but really, one cannot have a meaningful conversation with someone in a drunken state. After a while, the ride became silent, and after a few minutes in that silence, I broke it with the most fiendish of conversations. "So you'll catch the Prowler in no time, huh? He doesn't have the necessary skills to evade your intellect for much longer, you say?" The inspector mumbled something in agreement and said in a slurred speech that yes, I will catch this Prowler in no time. I then pulled my jacket flap to the side and reached for the sheath on the side of my vest. "Well, Inspector, you are right about one thing. You have finally found the Prowler, and as I told him that life-changing news, I slashed my blade across his throat, and as I did so, his eyes widened with a look of surprise. No doubt. He sat there and writhed in agony, bringing his hands up to his throat, trying to stop the blood. I sat there and laughed, congratulating him on finally solving the case. He then turned his head and looked at me, thinking God only knows what, completely confused, I'm sure, at the events that have just transpired. I then took my blade and finished the cocky inspector off, driving it into his ear, through his head, and out the other side. I then tossed the prick's body out of the carriage on the side of the road, and we returned home. Wait till everyone finds out about this, I thought. The head inspector of the Prowler case disposed of so easily. The man who was supposed to bring the Prowler to his demise. People are going to lose their shite. Now, they'll know it doesn't matter who you are or what you do in this life. No one can escape. The Prowler. The Prowler, Part 8. The sun hits my face and I awake more alive than ever. A rejuvenation is not a strong enough word to describe it. More like a rebirth. Yes, that's perfect. I feel reborn. With the sure-to-be setback of the Prowler investigation, thanks to Inspector Richard's demise, to a beautiful evening with Lady Smith, things just could not be any better at the moment. I threw back the covers and sprung out of bed, then got dressed quickly, for today I feel like fetching the paper myself. I want to hear the reactions. I want to feel the fear from the rabble as they read the news of the inspector's demise by my hand. I jumped into the waiting carriage, and we were on our way. Sitting there, I almost forgot I had just killed a man just a few short hours ago. Excellent job with the cleaning, James, I thought. There's no sign of anything. The blood is gone, the tiny chunks of flesh removed. Marvelous work. I would tell James this, but I wouldn't want such lavish compliments to go to his head now. We finally pull into the square, and when I open the carriage door, I'm greeted with a buzz that satiated my most carnivorous urges. The fear that permeated the air was thick, like the fog that rolls in on a dark London night. I pushed my way through the horde of the dismayed and disbelieved, mumbling to themselves in their confusion and panicked states. As I finally exited the mass of common filth, I hastily procured one of the last copies remaining of the London Journal from the shoddy-looking paperboy standing on the corner. Let's see what the peanut gallery has to say about recent events, shall we? Oh, and right away the headline is quite catching. Head Inspector in charge of Prowler's slayings meets own demise at the hands of the man he was trying to stop. Horrible news to report, dear readers. The man Scotland Yard pegged weeks ago to head the investigation into the Prowler slayings has met his own horrific demise. The body of Inspector Clive Richards was found discarded on the side of the road in the early morning hours. The inspector's lifeless body was found having his throat severed and an entrance wound from a blade entering one ear and coming out the other. The inspector was leaving the policeman's ball, which he and other prominent figures attended last night at Burlington Manor. The inspector was seen all through the night enjoying himself, but it is not known at this time when he left or with whom, if anyone he left with. The Commissioner of Her Majesty's West End Police Service, Nigel Burlington, whose family also hosted the policeman's ball, declined to go into detail, but did go on to express his remorse to the young inspector's family, and also expressed his own shock at the events which took the young inspector's life. He also wanted to reassure the citizens of the West End that the investigation into the Prowler will continue without delay, and a new man in charge will be appointed post-haste. We'll see who Commissioner Burlington and other top Scotland Yard officials choose to head the Prowler investigation, but whoever it is must bring this bloodthirsty Prowler to justice, and do it swiftly. In other news related to the Prowler, news of his exploits have reached across the pond to our American cousins. From coast to coast across the country, tales of his butchery have gone out to the citizens from every major newspaper. There's also been rumors of a famous American lawman asked to lend his expertise to the investigation. Famed peacekeeper Wyatt Earp is in town with his wife, and our societal columnist, Jonathan Swifts, interviewed him just last night as Mr. Earp and his wife left the old London theater. Mr. Earp was asked if the rumors were true, and he said there was no volition to said innuendo. Myself and Mr. Swift can also report there is no truth to these rumors, as Mr. Earp, though legendary, is retired and uninterested. Until tomorrow, dear readers, stay safe. Oh my, how beautiful! What excellence! The Prowler has gone international. My reign of terror will be known far and wide. Every corner of the world will know my name. I stood there with a feeling of exhilaration, surrounded by a mass, whimpering and worried for the state of their very souls. I made my way back through the decay of society and into the friendly confines of my carriage, hastily returning back to the manor. The day's agenda was slim. The afternoon dragged on, long and boring. Dinner was not much better. Nothing noteworthy taking place. Just more dull conversation with Father regarding my date tomorrow night with Lady Smith. He's really pushing a match between our two families, and little does he know his wish might come to fruition. I was to go out tonight and procure another victim, but my bloodlust has waned, at least for tonight anyway. My mind is on other things, particularly the lovely morsel, Lady Smith. She is all that has filled my thoughts since last evening. I'm not worried, though. I know my bloodlust will return shortly. She hasn't soothed the savage beast completely. But what I think I shall do before bed is to compose a letter to leave on my next victim. I slid back the chair and sat down at the writing desk and began. I prowl the halls. I prowl the streets. I prowl the alleyways where people meet. In the shadows where I do hide, I slash my knife across your eyes. Now you are blind, nowhere to run. Just blood-red tears that blot the sun. You're dying slowly, but dead you'll be. You just met the Prowler, and the Prowler is me. I can't be caught. I will not stop. Down the streets I continue to stalk. So be on the lookout and always pray, for tonight it's you that I may slay. Perfectly composed, I must say so myself. Almost a poem of death, if you will. I shall leave this on the bodies of my future victims. Think of it as a macabre calling card. The midnight hour approaches. 'Tis getting late. I must rest now, for tomorrow is going to be a busy day. I woke around 8 and promptly got dressed for the day. After a quick breakfast, I performed my daily duties, but with always an eye pointed towards tonight. As the hours grew nearer and nearer, I grew more excited for my dinner date with Lady Smith. I was to promptly pick her up in front of Smith Manor at 7 o'clock, where from there we will dine at one of the West End's finest dining establishments, the Regal Schooner. As 6 approached, I got dressed in my finest of tuxedos. The hair was slicked, the facial hair waxed, and powders and sprays were addressed accordingly. I was a fine-looking and proper-smelling gentleman, if I do say so myself. I strapped my surgical knife in its sheath to my vest, just in case the mood strikes me later on in the evening. One never knows when the urge to kill will beckon. I then made my way down the stairs and into the waiting carriage, where I ordered James to proceed to Smith Manor at once. We made excellent time, and I was standing in front of Smith Manor at 7 sharp. I then scaled the steps and rapped on her door. A young butler named Phineas answered, and I told him Lady Smith's escort was here. He left to fetch her, and I waited in the foyer. While I waited, a voice greeted me from the parlor. It was Lord Smith, Brandy's father. We had a polite conversation while we waited. A very jovial man with a booming voice. Very pleasant to be around. Just then I looked up and saw the beauty who was my date, standing at the top of the stairs. No matter how many times I see her, she still takes my breath away. I moved to the bottom of the stairs and waited, telling her how beautiful she looked this evening. She grinned and thanked me for the compliment as she walked down the stairs towards me. I reached out for her hand and kissed it delicately, then took her by the arm and proceeded to the carriage. I told James to proceed to the regal schooner. As we made our way, me and Lady Smith began to converse, and even though it had been 2 days, nothing had changed. We continued on right from where we left off at the ball, and we were so enthralled in our conversation, we arrived at the restaurant before we knew it. I stepped out of the carriage and asked for her hand to help her down the steps. I then once again asked for her arm. Then we proceeded into the restaurant, where we were escorted to the establishment's finest table, away from the rest of the dining crowd. We sat by candlelight and continued our lovely conversation. We sampled the finest things from the menu, from the freshest lobsters to the rare Italian cuisine, which so happened to be Lady Smith's favorite, all enjoyed with the finest of wines. Perfect accompaniments to our conversation that was unfolding. We delved deep into our lives, getting to know one another completely and truly, and once again there were things we found out about each other as if we had already known. Soulmates, through and through. I was beginning to fall for her more and more by the second, and more deeply in love, it seemed, by the sentence. And the best part is, it seemed as if she was feeling the same way for me. Sadly, such a beautiful conversation was only interrupted by the incompetence of some fool that the restaurant hired to be a waiter. This clumsy bastard decided to spill a lovely tomato bisque soup all over my beautiful date. The prick spilled it all over Lady Smith's beautiful turquoise dress, ruining it instantly. With her charm and grace, she laughed it off and forgave the bastard instantly, but I myself could not, and his actions of buffoonery set my blood into a boiling rage. I quickly jumped up from the table and started berating the clumsy fool, demanding his firing. I grabbed a bowl of soup and emptied its remaining contents onto his head. Just then Brandy's hand grazed mine. I looked down and she stared back up at me with a gentle smile and said everything is fine. Don't think another thought about the matter, my darling. I slowly sat back down and smiled back at her and said, of course, my love. We shall not worry about such things any further. In my mind, however, I looked back at the fool, and in my mind I was plotting his demise. I didn't think I was killing tonight, but after this incident, my blade is about to get bloodied once again. Not long after, we finished our lovely meal, and sadly it was time for this beautiful evening to come to an end. But before leaving, I excused myself from the table and made a trip to the men's room. I told Lady Smith I would be just a moment, for her to please wait for me at the table. She of course graciously said yes, and I made my leave. My intentions, however, were on the nefarious side. You see, after the incident, I had been keeping a hunter's eye on the clumsy bastard who calls himself a waiter. My eyes had been stalking his every movement, and I noticed in the corner of my eye he's about to make a trip to the back of the restaurant, where I'm assuming he's about to dispose of the rubbish he's carrying in his hands. I got up from the table and made my way towards the bathroom, which thankfully for me is next to the back door of the restaurant that leads out into the alleyway where the waiter just went through. I reached the bathroom door and turned my head, making sure no one was watching me. And when no one was looking, I quickly went through the back door into the alley. When I happened upon him, he was placing the rubbish up against the wall, and as he started to turn around to see who just walked through the door, I quickly pulled my surgical blade from its sheath, and as he saw, it was me. I slashed it across his throat. His eyes widened as he clenched his throat, trying to stop the blood from flowing. I then took my blade and jammed it into his heart. I then removed the blade and jammed it into his forehead, killing him instantly. While he slumped down to the floor, I decided to take some trophies, taking my blade and removing his hands. The clumsy bastard didn't know what to do with them anyway. I then quickly composed myself as best I could and returned back into the restaurant. I felt somewhat apprehensive as I approached the table. I should have stopped into the bathroom to check my state in the mirror. That was an awfully bloody mess. I sure hope I didn't get any on me. I stopped and smiled at Lady Smith and asked her if she was ready to go. She smiled back and said yes. She had a lovely evening, but it was getting late, and she was becoming quite tired. I asked for her arm, and we were on our way back into the carriage, where we continued our lovely conversation, and back to Smith Manor, where I kissed her hand and bid her a good night. I asked if she would permit me to call on her again, and she smiled and said, yes, of course. We arranged another rendezvous in 2 days' time, and we said our final good night. I watched as she went back into the manor, then retreated into my carriage and returned home. I went to bed filled with so many emotions, still coming down from my lover's high and still recovering from my bloodlust. I have, however, come to the conclusion that Lady Smith is the one for me. When that miscreant did what he did to her, I instantly wanted to tear him limb from limb, and I did. So everyone best watch out, for Lady Smith is one to kill for. The Prowler, Part 9. As the ray of sun hit my face from a crack in the curtain, it did not wake me, for I was already lying there, staring up at the ceiling. It was not a good night of sleeping. Yes, I went to bed on a high, with thoughts of Lady Smith and dispatching that waiter. But that's the thing. There lies the problem. I had horrific nightmares all through the night of being caught, so badly and realistic that it has me thinking, was I careful? Did I act too brashly in killing him on the spot? In merely minutes after, I screamed at him in public. How will that look? What will they think? He spilled soup on Lady Smith, I scream at him, and then boom, he's dead. And did the lovely Lady Smith notice anything on my person? Were there droplets of blood or pieces of flesh on me when I came back to the table? Or will she suspect me if she sees the paper? I hope my temper didn't get the better of me. I have to control myself from now on and be more mindful of my surroundings. Speaking of the paper, I need to see what the prick Parker Johns has to say of my latest escapade. I had to wait incredibly long for James to bring me my paper. I sat there twiddling my thumbs, waiting to catch up on news of my macabre endeavors, and fucking James is taking his sweet-ass time doing God knows what. When he walked in, I gave him quite the tongue-lashing. He tried to give me excuses, but that only made me angrier. I felt my blood begin to boil, as it does right before I kill one of my victims. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I have to calm myself. It's too early, and the household is already in full operation. Killing him just isn't feasible at the moment. But James is starting to get on my nerves. I barked at him to leave the tray and paper on the bed and get the hell out of my chambers. I unfurled the paper. The headline read, Prowler slays latest victim at posh West End eatery, possibly second body found near Thames. Late last night, the body of Miles Stanford, a waiter at the Regal Schooner, was found in the back alley of the establishment during closing. His throat was slit, and there were stab wounds to his chest and forehead. His hands were removed post-death, believed to be the latest trophies added to the Prowler's collection. A letter was also found on the body, more like a dark and demented poetic calling card, if you will. This prowler's depravity knows no bounds. Also, a second body was found on the banks of the Thames River, a young woman who looks to have been a maid, judging from her attire. Scotland Yard isn't quite certain she's a prowler victim. Her body is very badly decomposed from being out in the elements for days, but there are hallmarks of it being a prowler slain. Scotland Yard is asking wealthy households to report if they're missing any maids under their employ, so that they might be able to identify the body. 2 more victims to add to this mad prowler's list. Who will save us from this madman? On that note, Scotland Yard has picked a new man to lead the prowler investigation, and Inspector Willard Barnsworth is the man. A veteran of Her Majesty's Royal Dragoons and a grizzled veteran of the police force, enjoying long careers in both. Sounds just like the man we need in charge of the prowler investigation. Toughness and experience. Good luck to you, sir. Until tomorrow, dear readers, stay safe and good luck. Well, it looks as if my temper did not do me in, this time anyway, and they finally found the body of that busybody Liza. Took them long enough. I'd hate to see the state she's in now, decomposing out in the elements, next to the water. Nasty business, I'm sure. I knew it was an excellent idea to dispose of her carcass on the banks of the Thames. Nobody cares of the trash that hangs about there. I'll have to keep a stern eye on James. He seemed awfully strange after disposing of Liza, getting drunk once again after he returned back to the manor. Also, I'm interested to see how Lady Smith will react to reading the waiter who served us was horrifically murdered after the incident we had with him. Will she put 2 and 2 together? Will she be apprehensive about me now? Will she call off our date for tomorrow? All questions, I guess, that will be answered shortly. For now, I must slither out of my bed and start the new day. I get dressed and head down to breakfast. I must confess, the smiling faces and cheery staff that greets me on my way downstairs sickens me. It's just too damn early for such blissful dispositions. I was on the verge of screaming at them, "You're a maid! Act like it! What do you have to be so bloody happy about? We're not paying you that much." My anger was peaking at a murdering level. Once again, I had to compose myself. That's twice already, and it isn't even breakfast yet. I must go back out tonight. I have to take out this rage on somebody. Sadly, the rest of breakfast didn't go much better. Father and everyone else read about the body of a young maid being found, and that's all anyone could talk about. Father wants me to accompany him to the West End police station's morgue to identify the body. It's unbelievable. I have to take time out of my day to go down and identify that filth. After a most unpleasant breakfast, me and Father got into the carriage and went down to the station. We were ushered down to the morgue and shown the corpse. They pulled back the cover, and we were hit with a rancid stench of decay. The reports of her decomposition were not over-exaggerated. She was barely recognizable. The rats and whatever other foul creatures that hang about the shores of the Thames took their time eating away at her the past few days. It was her, though, and Father told them her name and that she worked at our estate. I was becoming quite bored at this time, though. All I could think about was being glad I wasn't being shorted a victim. Add her to the list, lads. And what an impressive list it is turning out to be. From the common filth that walks the streets, to its civil servants and the high-born alike. Women, men, old, young. It does not matter. No one is safe from my reach." We returned to the manor, where Father proceeded to inform the rest of the family and staff of young Liza's demise. I did not feel like performing an act of caring or sadness, so I excused myself and retired to my chambers. I could give two shits about Liza. The rest of the day was uneventful, and dinner was even worse. Just more whining about Liza, how and why kind of questioning. I sat there becoming angered, wanting and wishing I could just scream at them exactly how and why it happened. The how, because I can. The why, because I wanted to. That's just what I do. Plus, I'd love to say, she wouldn't be dead if she wasn't so damn nosy. I wouldn't have had to kill her if she had just kept to herself. Oh well. I grew tired of the conversation and went back upstairs. I had to prepare for my night's excursion. My instruments of death were sharpened and readied. My gentleman's attire, fine pressed and suited to my liking. I adorned my top hat and cloak and made my way to the carriage. I instructed James to drive me to Charing Cross Road, and away we went. Like a creeping death, the carriage went through the countryside and city streets until we reached our destination. I told James to wait with the carriage, and I took to the streets. The cool night's air hit my cheek, and I was alive again. I started down the street, slowly and moving closer to the wall, trying my best to cling to the shadows. I moved about like a predator in the jungle, and luckily for me, tonight the prey was in abundance. Peddlers and the ladies of the night were out selling their wares, with customers eager to buy. Storefronts still open, with people strewn about their front stoops, lovers walking hand in hand in a warm embrace. The prey was aplenty, and the best part was there were few constables to stop me. I stayed in the shadows, mixing in with the crowd. In the corner of my eye, I spotted a sailor propositioning a woman of the evening and saw them duck into the alleyway. I followed, carefully making my way to the entrance to the alley. It was dark, with minimal light, perfect for me to strike. And when I saw the fellow undo his pants and lady hike up her dress, strike I did. I moved on them with unmerciful fury. I drove my blade through the back of the sailor's neck, and when he slumped down to the ground, I quickly covered the woman's mouth with my hand to prevent her from screaming. I slammed her hard against the wall, dazing her for a moment. I then ran my blade across her throat with enough force I could hear the flesh tear, like when you rip up paper. They both sat on the ground writhing in agony, but I was not done. I took my trophies next. I proceeded to take their most private of parts, castrating them with just a few swipes of my surgical blade. I then laid them out, performing, if you will, a cruel amateur autopsy, my blade and hatchet cutting and ripping wherever I saw fit. My bloodlust was being satiated with every stroke of my wrist. I then collected my things, trophies, and instruments, and headed back onto the main thoroughfare. The crowd had thinned a bit. The peddlers had dispersed, and the majority of the shops had closed, except for one. I stood in front of that shop, contemplating my next move. It had already been a most glorious, bloody night, but as a widening, sinister grin moved across my face, I thought to myself, it could always be better. The shop was called Madame Mina's Fine Jewelry and Accessories. No one was inside, and it looked like she was preparing to close. So I quickly went inside and asked her, "I would like to look at your finest pieces before you close." On the counter she laid before me exquisite pieces adorned with the finest diamonds and rubies. She asked me if it was for someone special. My mind drifted from the macabre, devious plan to Lady Smith for a moment. One of these pieces would be perfect for her, I thought. I told Madame Mina yes, it would be for the woman I am courting, a very special woman. She showed me the finest piece of jewelry in the shop, hell, maybe the finest in the realm, a necklace adorned with turquoise rubies and beautiful diamonds, with a turquoise ring to match. I told her that was it. That was the piece. She said excellent choice, and the price of the item. I then took my billfold out from my vest and sat it on the counter. While she was looking down and wrapping up the piece of jewelry, my mind snapped back to the task at hand. I quickly bent down and pulled the blade from my bag, and right as she looked up, I slashed it across her open mouth. I tried for her throat, but she had jerked up and back. I then reached forward and grabbed the back of her head, and with my other hand, I placed the butt of the blade handle on the countertop, with the blade pointing straight up. She began to struggle and tried to free her head from my grip, but I held tighter, then slammed her forehead down onto my blade, driving it through her skull. I then hastily ran to the door and locked it, and put the close sign in the window so I would not be disturbed, and once again collected my trophies. I proceeded to remove her fingers and ears, any part that had jewelry, then put my things back in the bag and retrieved the jewelry I purchased for Lady Smith. Which reminds me, in my haste I almost forgot to pay for it. I pulled the correct amount from my billfold and placed it on the counter. I'm not a thief after all. I snuck out the back of the shop and made my way back to the carriage, unseen and undetected, a bag full of trophies and a rage quenched. Of all the carnage I've bestowed this city, tonight was my most violent yet. People are going to remember this night. Let it be known as the Night of the Three. Let it be known as the Night of the Prowler. The Prowler, Part 10. I've awoken on this day, drowsy and still very much tired from last night's escapade of death, which is quite understandable with the extra work I took on upon myself. No complaints really, though, for I do not consider what I do work. It's quite enjoyable, as a matter of fact. I sat up in bed, and as I did so, James walked into my chambers and brought me my morning coffee and the newspaper. I don't know what's going on with that man, but he was once again late. James is beginning to annoy me more and more as of late, and I don't know how much more I can bear. I opened the paper and was quite pleased with the catching headline, "Most Gruesome Night Yet. The Bloody Three Left Strewn About Charing Cross Road." I am sickened and horrified to report, dear readers, a most horrendous night just transpired. In a spree that's been bloody and horrible to begin with, last night was the Prowler's most bloody to date. 3 victims were unbelievably savaged by the Prowler all along Charing Cross Road, and surprisingly, I've learned that the street was packed with citizens of the West End, but that still had no effect on the Prowler's ability to move about and claim his victims. The silent killer claimed the lives of a man and woman, both found next to each other in an alleyway. The woman, a Miss Tabitha Thwaites, an alleged woman of the evening, and the man, a young sailor by the name of Nicholas Treatworthy. Both were savagely ripped apart, and their privates were removed. Also, a cruel autopsy was performed on the pair. The Prowler's signature macabre poem was also found on each of the bodies. Also, the body of Mrs. Mina Percival, or as she's also known, Madame Mina, the proprietor of Madame Mina's jewelry shop, was found savagely slain inside her establishment. Her fingers, ears, and whatever other body parts that she wore jewelry on were removed, and she also had the Prowler's poem placed upon her person. Such savagery, placed on the citizens of the West End, is simply unspeakable. Scotland Yard is said to also be taken aback by last night's carnage, and are dubbing the night of the Bloody Three. Our city continues to be preyed upon by two killers, squeezing us from opposite ends. Who will help us? Until tomorrow, dear readers, stay safe out there, and good luck. Oh my word, I must say I like the sound of that. The Night of the Bloody Three. It's like music to my ears. It just rolls ever so smoothly off the tip of the tongue. Most excellent. I, however, do not appreciate towards the end the incursion of that prick Jack the Ripper by that bastard Parker Johns. No, his name was not mentioned, but everyone knows who he was talking about. Two killers? Don't worry about two killers, I say. You all best be worried about me. I don't like sharing my news with someone else. These are my headlines. Something is going to have to be done about this. My mood went from a high to now having to try and calm myself from my boiling rage. I threw the paper aside in disgust and went downstairs for breakfast. The help greeting me in their cheerful dispositions, making me sick as I passed them, trying to suppress the acidity buildup of vomit creeping up my esophagus. Something must be done about that. I must make a note of that to the head butler, Mr. Lyles. It's too damn early for such pleasantries, and there must be a stop put to such cheeriness. I gritted my teeth and made my way to the table. There waiting for me was the entire family, usually not always fully present, but today they were. Father sat at the head of the table, and Nigel and his slag of a wife, Agatha, sat to my left. Sweet Lord, I wanted to cut my ears off with the knife that laid before me on the table when I heard her voice greet me, "Good morning." Why my brother ever married that social climber, I'll never know, but it offends my senses ever so much, and my disposition is usually quite charming. I sat and tried to enjoy my proper breakfast, but was interrupted by idle chit-chat. First, it was Father, wanting to know if I wanted to help him conduct interviews for the new maid position. I informed him I had plans. In my mind, however, I was screaming. I mean, Jesus Christ, do we really need another one of those cheery heartlets traipsing around here, darkening my mood in the morning and possibly meddling in my affairs? Then my brother chimed in, wanting to know if I wanted to accompany him and Agatha out to eat. I replied, no thank you to that. I have plans with the lovely Lady Smith tonight. Agatha then felt the need to chime in and ask if we would like to have dinner with them. A double date, if you will. Well, my temper got the better of me, and I informed Agatha I would never subjugate someone as fine a person as Lady Smith to someone as untrustworthy and slimy as yourself. She feigned shock, and my brother spoke up trying to defend his wife, but I put a stop to that shit quickly. I reminded him of his place, and he backed down like he always does. It's no wonder why the police, with all the inspectors and resources at their disposal, haven't even come close to stopping my murderous spree. With my brother in charge, everyone's been rendered useless. The fish rots from the head down, my friends, and thank God for that. As breakfast thankfully was coming to a close, I wanted to bring up an idea I had to Father before I left. You see, my favorite time of year was approaching, and I must admit my favorite holiday. It's not celebrated by all, maybe not even most. Side note, I must remember to ask someone in Parliament to pass it as an official holiday. But as I was saying, I enjoy it very much, and that holiday is All Hallows Eve. A night to remember the dead, if you will. It is supposed to be the one night of the year they can return after all. For my sake, I hope that's not entirely true. Father was hesitant at first, but when I told him my idea of throwing a costume ball, he changed his tune quickly. He never misses an opportunity to throw one of his famous costumed affairs. The thought of hobnobbing with the other elites of the realm seems to be the only thing that gives that old bastard any pleasure. Oh, and once I informed him that our family would be the first to officially throw a All Hallows Eve ball, that sealed the decision. He wants to be the first at everything. Fine by me. Now I can celebrate my favorite holiday properly. So whoever out there loves to celebrate All Hallows Eve, remember, it's because I made it socially acceptable for you to do so. Father said preparations for the ball would start immediately, and I excused myself from the table. I retired to my chambers to properly look after my instruments of death. Nothing of importance was on the afternoon's agenda, so I thought it to be the proper time to maintain my tools. I opened my bag, and oh, what a sight it was. Carnage everywhere. I really made a mess of things last night. I firstly collected my trophies and put them away properly in my secret vault, which, by the way, I must remember to document later, the process I take on securing and storing my trophies. But that's for a later date. I then pulled out my instruments and began to painstakingly clean every inch of them. They were especially messy after last night's events. Pieces of flesh clung to the blade and on the bottom of the bag. I'll have to wash that out as well. It took a while, but I cleaned my tools to perfection. I took my time restoring them to their proper state, as one should do if they want to maintain nice things. By the time I was finished, you could use my surgical blade to carve up the finest roast beast and not have a second thought. I spent the rest of the afternoon updating this journal and starting up my memoirs, and before I knew it, it was time to get ready for my date with that beautiful Lady Smith. The finest suit in my collection was adorned. The hair was slicked, mustache waxed, and cologne to the proper proportions. I was looking like a proper gentleman for Lady Smith, no doubt about that. I grabbed my cloak and top hat and made my way to the carriage. I told James to proceed to Smith Manor, and we made our way. On the way, I noticed I left the manor without my blade. I felt nude and vulnerable, but as the Smith Manor came into view, my thoughts quickly changed to Lady Smith. She stood there waiting for me, looking as beautiful as ever. I got out of the carriage and walked up to my beautiful date. I greeted her and kissed her hand. She smiled at me and gave me her arm. I escorted her to the carriage and off we went. We sat and talked. I told her how much I missed her, and she said the same. She then asked where I was taking her. I told her we were going to the finest establishment in all of London for a beautiful meal and dancing at the Bistro Le Steak, the finest steakhouse in the country. run by a Frenchman named Pierre, who's an excellent chef. The night was beautiful. We danced the night away and sat down and had a beautiful meal. While having dinner, I asked her if she would like to accompany me to the All Hallows Eve ball I was throwing. I was nervous at her response, but she flashed a wide smile and said yes, of course. She continued that it was her favorite holiday, even though it wasn't wildly celebrated. I expressed my agreement and told her how happy I was that I found someone who felt the same. She smiled and we finished our wonderful evening. I took her back to Smith Manor, and we said good night at her front door. She thanked me for a wonderful evening, and I thanked her. I looked into her eyes, and she allowed me to kiss her. I told her I'd see her at the ball, and we said good night. Things were becoming quite serious with Lady Smith, and I loved it. I rode back to the manor on a high, excited about the future. When I arrived back home, I got out of the carriage and realized I hadn't killed anyone tonight. I felt unaccomplished, but what could I do? I stood on the front steps as James took the carriage to the carriage house, staring up at the moon. As I looked back down, about to head inside, I noticed from the corner of my eye my brother's wife trapezing into the stables with a stable hand. I always told my brother he couldn't trust that floozy, and once again I was proven to be correct, like always. I stood there for a moment, thinking of what to do, but only for a moment. Do I go get my brother and show him what his wife is up to? No, I think I have something better in mind. I crept through the night towards the stables. I could see the glow from the candle emanating through the window as I approached. As I ducked underneath the windowsill, planning my next move, I smelled coitus and chocolates. Yes, that was the smell. I then moved over to the stable door and peeked through the crack. I saw them lounging in a chair. I noticed a pitchfork to my left for baling hay. I grabbed it and cast a devious stare in their direction. And when the stable hand got up to put his pants back on, I swung the doors open and pounced on them with furious anger. I drove the pitchfork into Agatha's throat, and before the stable hand could turn around, I pulled the pitchfork out of her throat and jammed it into his skull. I then turned back to Agatha and finished her off with a few more stabs from the pitchfork. I then noticed hanging on the wall some pruning shears the gardener uses and decided to snip off some trophies for my collection. I was going to fetch James and have him remove the bodies, but on second thought, I want to leave them strewn about, discovered, all bloodied and torn apart. I adorned their corpses with my poem and grabbed a piece of that fine chocolate before I left. Much too fine an item to waste on trash like that. I then returned to the manor in the cover of darkness, and the most beautiful part was that not a soul was out. No one saw a thing. The Prowler, Part 11. I was awoken earlier than usual by the sweet sounds of anguish and pain. Sounds like the bodies were just discovered of the stable hand and my brother's poor excuse for a wife. I can hear him screaming. It brings my heart much joy to hear such things. Makes one feel alive and accomplished. The whole household is awake now. I hear the stirring of the help and the booming screams of father asking how this could happen here on his property. This will make for some headline-catching news, I thought. 2 massacred bodies found on the stately grounds of one of England's most important families. How lovely for me. I know a gentleman such as myself shouldn't be concerned with such trivial things, but I must stay ahead of that no-good bastard, Jack the Ripper. He's no gentleman, and I won't be bested by some lowlife. I quickly sprung out of bed and slipped on my robe. I figured I ought to make an appearance and feign remorse for those 2 poor souls. I tried to hide the pep in my step as I made my way down the stairs, everyone moving around me, frantic and hurried. I was first greeted by the head butler, Mr. Lyles, informing me of the demise of my sister-in-law. "My word!" I exclaimed, doing my best impression of someone who actually gave a shite. I then made my way outside with the rest of the servants and family. Scotland Yard was already at the stable. The new head inspector, Mr. Farnsworth, was standing just a mere few feet in front of me. I looked upon the man, watching his every movement. And if this is the gentleman they picked to stop me and pin their hopes on, well, I'm afraid to inform them that they're on for a rude awakening, because this man is no match for my skills. As I stood watching, continuing to canvass the area, I heard a high-pitched voice come from the left of me. I turned my head, and standing before me was a will-o'-the-wisp gentleman, wee and frail. He stood there asking anyone he approached questions pertaining to the crime. He held a small journal and a pen, and transcribed notes in said journal whenever he received information from whoever he spoke to. My God, could it be? Could this be the man himself standing before me, the notorious Parker Johns in the flesh, chronicler of my exploits? I gave him a once-over. About what I expected, I thought to myself. A man who's frail and weak, someone who can't do the deed themselves, so they have to resort to writing of others' accomplishments. Typical writer. He moved from person to person, witness to witness, trying to gather information, running around like some frantic bug. The man sickens me. I held the urge to vomit as he approached me. Of course he would want a statement from the family and member of the household. And with my brother grief-stricken and father consoling him, it fell to me to have to talk to this scum. He introduced himself in a snide, smugly tone. I told him I knew who he was, trying to hide my disdain as I said the words. He addressed me by my proper titles and was on his best behavior, thinking that will get him somewhere, no doubt. But sadly for him, all of his ass-kissery will get him nowhere. I informed him that no one in the family saw or heard a thing. We were all fast asleep in our chambers and have no earthly clue why Agatha was out in the stables with the stable hand, but my brother and the family are deeply saddened by her untimely demise. He tried to press for further information, but as I said before, no one in the household saw or heard a thing. I could hear myself starting to lose my cool. My temper was beginning to show. I bid him a farewell, but as I started to walk away, he spoke to me with such condescendence and spewed, "That's not correct, sir. There was a witness in the household this evening." I slowly turned and looked upon the man. Is that so? Well, who would this supposed witness be, then? I asked in the most smug tone I could muster. The maid Gertrude said she heard moaning, and what she thought sounded to be a faint scream. And around the same time, not long after, the gardener Wilkins claimed he thought he saw a silhouette flee from the stables, but lost it in the dark. I stood there, feeling the anger begin to rise, but doing my best to suppress it. I smiled at him and said, "That's very interesting. What a shame they didn't get a proper look at the culprit." He then asked me one final question. He asked me what I thought of this Prowler fellow, and the terror he's caused these past months. I looked at him, knowing I would have to do my best actor's performance and pull some disdain and anguish from somewhere deep in my body's core. The Prowler has become quite the cunning nuisance, hasn't he? He's caused a lot of pain and suffering to the people in our community and to the loved ones of his victims, which now you can add our family to his ever-growing list. Hopefully, Scotland Yard will apprehend this Prowler post-haste. I smiled and bid Mr. Johns a good night and turned back towards the manor. Pretty good performance, if I do say so myself. Shite. It took all I had not to strangle the bastard right on the spot. I made my way back to my chambers and went back to sleep. Acting like I gave a shite was very tiring. I awoke a few hours later, with a buzz still filling the air and the grounds right outside my window. James arrived not long after with my coffee and morning paper. Anxious to see what Mr. Johns had to say, I unfurled the paper and saw the headline: Prowler strikes one of the realm's most influential families. Slays police commissioner's wife. In the early morning hours, 2 bodies were found savagely murdered at Burlington Manor, one being the body of Agatha Burlington, the wife of West End Police Commissioner Nigel Burlington, and the other body being a one Bruce McGill, a stable hand in the family's employ. Both were horrifically torn apart, and parts were removed as a Prowler's sick trophies, and like at many other scenes and on many other bodies, the Prowler's macabre poem was left upon their corpses. I spoke with the Earl-in-Waiting, Lord Neville Burlington, and he expressed the family's sadness, especially that of his brother, and expressed his dismay of the Prowler situation, and hopes Scotland Yard will put an end to it swiftly and promptly. I asked if he had seen or heard anything from last night's attack, but he informed me that neither he or anyone else in the manor heard or saw a thing. But after some thorough due diligence on my part, I found a household maid who said she heard moaning and thought to have heard a scream not long after. And the gardener claimed he saw a silhouette flee the stables and vanish into the darkness. I'm left saddened and baffled once again. More death has befelled our community once again, dear readers, and sadness has struck one of our nation's finest families. When will this madness end? Until tomorrow, dear readers, good luck and stay safe. Very nicely done. I do feel an overwhelming amount of joy in my accomplishments. My skill with my blade and disposing of my victims are unmatched, and my skill of deception and acting are beyond reproach. Look at that beautiful act of deception I just performed on Mr. Johns. I fooled the man. I fool everybody. I will not be caught by the likes of these fools. I'm surrounded by simpletons and foolhardy bastards, and people like Mr. Johns wonder why they're lambs for the slaughter. It is because you're protected by weaklings, and for I am the wolf, cunning and deadly. I will stalk and kill you without mercy, and I have 2 new prey to add to my list. It's time to dispose of the maid and the gardener. I would like to give a heartfelt thank you to the special friends of the channel for your overwhelming generosity. If you would like to support the channel, the link is below in the description. Also, please send me your stories and poems to duchessofdarkness27@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram at duchess.ofdarkness and Twitter at duchessofdarkn2. I want to thank all my listeners for your kindness, your encouragement, and your support. It means the world to me. Thank you for joining me. Until next time.